Mist drifted across the moors at dawn, soft as breath upon glass, and Hawthorne Hall rose from it like some ancient, brooding monument to England's rigid order, an estate where silence was a virtue, obedience a necessity, and reputation the one fragile currency everyone feared to lose. Within its vast kitchens, where heat from the great iron stoves met the chill of the stone floors, Helene moved with the earnest precision of someone who knew her position depended on appearing invisible. At 22, she possessed a quiet dignity born not of privilege, but of survival, having fled the turmoil of France with nothing but her skill, her memory of spices, and the unwavering resolve to build a life unmarred by pity. The servants often whispered that she carried herself with more grace than many ladies above stairs, yet it was a grace that invited envy rather than admiration, for in Hawthorne Hall ambition in a servant was considered a dangerous spark. That morning, she had risen earlier than the others, compelled by a restlessness she could not name. Perhaps it was the storm of noble guests expected to arrive, or perhaps it was the subtle tightening in the air, something unspoken, as though the walls themselves braced for unwelcome news. She collected a crate of winter vegetables and made her way toward the rear storeroom, where the kitchen corridor met the Duke's private study, a poorly planned architectural quirk that had long been blamed for overheard secrets. Helene never lingered there. A foreigner living on the mercy of English nobility knew too well how quickly suspicion could take root. Yet as she stepped into the narrow passage, she froze, startled by the low murmur of two men's voices drifting through the half-open study door. She had no intention of eavesdropping, but one word, spoken in French, sharp and hurried, caught her breath. Another followed, then another, each threading together into a short, coded fragment that made her blood run cold. She shifted her weight, meaning to retreat quietly, but her foot caught on a loose stone, sending a thin clatter echoing down the corridor. The voices ceased. Panic surged. She set the crate down and knelt as if rearranging its contents, though her trembling hands betrayed her. When the door opened, she kept her gaze lowered, praying the intruders would pass without scrutiny. Instead, a stern-faced steward, Mr. Fallon, loomed above her. His eyes narrowed with immediate, hungry suspicion. "You there," he barked. "What business have you creeping about the Duke's study?" She attempted to answer, but fear constricted her voice. Fallon seized her wrist and pulled her upright. From inside the study, another man murmured something too distant to decipher, and Fallon's expression darkened further. He marched her down the corridor with a force that brooked no protest. The Duke awaited them in the central hall, his presence commanding yet unervingly composed. Edmund Ravensbury stood as though carved from marble, broad-shouldered, impeccably dressed, his expression a mask of cool detachment befitting a man taught to guard emotion as tightly as empire. Servants halted mid-task to watch as Fallon thrust Helene forward. Edmund regarded her with a measured, unreadable gaze, though something flickered there. Curiosity, perhaps, or irritation at having his morning disrupted. "This girl," Fallon announced, "was found loitering outside your study, my lord. She refuses to explain herself." Helene parted her lips, but the memory of the French words she had overheard tangled her thoughts. If she revealed them, she would be accused of spying. If she feigned ignorance, she risked confirming their suspicions. The silence stretched brittle and damning. Edmund exhaled once, softly, as though he had seen such incompetence before and was weary of repeating himself. "Miss Helene," he said, his tone cold enough to silence even the boldest servant, "I have neither the time nor the inclination for such carelessness. Pack your things and leave by nightfall." The words fell with the weight of a verdict. Around her, the staff exchanged swift glances, some pitying, others smug, all aware that dismissal from Hawthorne Hall meant not only unemployment but disgrace. Helene bowed her head in a desperate effort to preserve dignity, though humiliation burned through her composure. Fallon stepped aside, satisfied, and Edmund turned away without waiting for further explanation. Yet in the moment he pivoted, Helene glimpsed his profile, and thought she saw something unexpected. Uncertainty, almost imperceptible, as though some part of him questioned the severity of his decree. She retreated to her narrow room beneath the eaves, her steps wooden, her heartbeat wild with fear. The crate she had abandoned earlier still haunted her thoughts, but more than that, the whispered French phrases replayed with chilling clarity. If the words meant what she believed, then Hawthorne Hall was entangled in a scandal far greater than a servant's imagined trespass, one that threatened the very reputation of the Duke who had just cast her aside. She sank onto her cot and clasped her hands tightly, torn between the instinct to flee and the unexpected pull of responsibility. She had crossed no forbidden threshold, committed no treachery, yet the truth she carried was dangerous, perhaps even fatal if placed in the wrong hands. As dusk crept across the sky, she made her decision with a steadiness born of necessity rather than courage. She would not vanish in disgrace. She would act, even if no one thanked her, even if the Duke never learned what she risked for him. She gathered the one item she had retrieved from the passage, a crumpled page marked with the same coded script, and slipped into the twilight beyond the gates. Though her future was now uncertain, one thing felt undeniable. Whatever storm awaited Hawthorne Hall, she had already stepped into its heart, and the consequences of her choice would not be easily undone. Helene reached Lord Ashcombe's townhouse under a sky the color of tarnished silver, the hour late enough that most of London's respectable world had retreated behind shuttered windows. She hesitated at the threshold, painfully aware of her plain dress and the impropriety of approaching a statesman unannounced, yet necessity pushed her forward. When the butler attempted to dismiss her, she drew from her cloak the folded, coded letter. The man's expression shifted at the foreign markings, and after a tense moment, he ushered her inside with a begrudging nod. Lord Ashcombe appeared shortly thereafter, tall and grave, his features marked by the weary vigilance of one accustomed to navigating political currents. His voice softened when he noticed her trembling hands. She placed the letter on a polished table between them and explained, in careful English, what she had overheard. He listened without impatience, though his brows tightened with each word she spoke. When she finished, he regarded her with a solemn respect that startled her. The document, he said, confirmed suspicions he had long harbored about a clandestine faction within the Duke's advisory circle. If exposed carelessly, it could destroy Edmund's public standing. Helene felt a pang of relief that someone finally understood the peril, yet dread followed swiftly. By giving Ashcombe the letter, she had entwined herself irrevocably in the Duke's fate. At Hawthorne Hall, Edmund grappled with whispers of impropriety that spread like rot through Parliament's corridors. Reports of financial inconsistencies, subtle but damning, had begun to surface. He stood in his study, reviewing statements with increasing frustration, sensing the shadow of betrayal but unable to discern its source. His thoughts drifted again and again to the servant girl dismissed that morning. Fallon had claimed she loitered without purpose, yet Edmund recalled the panic in her eyes, and, beneath it, a fierce intelligence she had tried, and failed, to conceal. The memory unsettled him. He prided himself on precision of judgment, yet something about her dismissal gnawed at him, as though he had acted not with reason, but reflex hardened by years of inherited discipline. Before he could examine the thought further, a knock at the door interrupted him. Lord Ashcombe entered, carrying the coded letter Helene had delivered. Edmund felt the world contract as Ashcombe explained its contents, a scheme orchestrated from within his own council, designed to implicate Edmund in political misconduct. That the plot had nearly succeeded chilled him. When Ashcombe revealed that the letter had come from the dismissed cook, Edmund's composure fractured. Shame flickered across his face. He realized the woman he had cast out had not sought mischief, but had prevented catastrophe. An uncomfortable heat rose within him, part indignation at being deceived by his own advisors, part remorse for the injustice he had inflicted upon Helene. With quiet urgency, he instructed his steward to locate her immediately and ensure her safe return to the estate. The carriage found Helene at a modest inn on the outskirts of town, where she sat with a cup of tepid broth, unsure whether she would sleep or simply drift until dawn. When the driver presented the Duke's summons, she stiffened in disbelief. She expected accusation or rebuke, yet the summons bore no hint of threat. Curiosity, trepidation, and a faint, reluctant hope stirred within her as she followed the footman into the carriage. As they approached Hawthorne Hall once more, its towering silhouette seemed less like a fortress and more like a question waiting to be answered. Edmund awaited her in the drawing room, his posture immaculate, but his expression uncharacteristically unsettled. She curtsied, prepared for cold civility, but he stepped forward with a measured breath that suggested he fought for the right words. He acknowledged, with rare humility, that he had wronged her. His apology was not florid but earnest, stripped of aristocratic indifference. She studied him cautiously, sensing that the man before her was somehow altered from the one who had dismissed her without hesitation. When he offered her reinstatement, she expected to be sent back to the kitchens. Yet he spoke instead of a position assisting the household secretary, a role far removed from the stoves and scullery shadows. The promotion startled her, not only for its elevation but for the trust it implied. He extended a small silver token engraved with the Ravensbury crest, explaining it was a symbol of her new status. Though the gesture was couched in formal propriety, something in his tone suggested an unspoken sentiment he was not yet ready to name. She accepted it with a mixture of gratitude and bewilderment, uncertain whether he admired her courage or simply felt obligated to repay a debt. Still, she recognized sincerity in his eyes, a sincerity that softened some of the lingering wounds of humiliation. Days passed, and Helene's new responsibilities drew her into rooms she had never imagined entering. Quiet studies filled with documents, candlelit chambers where strategy was whispered, corridors where her presence prompted curious glances. Her proximity to the Duke became impossible for the household to ignore. She noticed that Edmund grew less remote with each interaction. He asked for her observations, listened without condescension, and occasionally allowed a brief smile to betray his austere facade. The change unsettled her as much as it stirred something fragile and new. One evening, as she sorted through correspondence, she discovered that a crucial document, one linked to the traitor's scheme, had vanished from the Duke's study. Panic shot through her. Someone had realized she posed a threat. She hurried to Edmund's chambers, intending to report the theft, but as she raised her hand to knock, the corridor behind her creaked. A shadow slipped away before she could identify it, leaving only the cold certainty that the web surrounding Hawthorne Hall had not loosened with her return. It had tightened. Rumors stirred through Hawthorne Hall with the persistence of winter drafts, slipping beneath door frames and into conversations that halted abruptly when Helene entered a room. Her elevation from cook to household secretary unsettled the established hierarchy, and envy sharpened the glances she received from staff who once ignored her entirely. Above stairs, the whispers were more poisonous. Some claimed the Duke had acted out of sentiment. Others insinuated motives far less honorable. Helene moved through these murmurs with disciplined grace, yet the weight of scrutiny pressed on her shoulders like a physical burden. She had never sought prominence, and yet every step she took now seemed to echo through corridors that judged her unworthy of being heard. Despite the tension, Edmund continued to entrust her with matters of growing significance. Their discussions, once stiff with formality, gradually unfolded into exchanges marked by mutual respect. Still, Edmund maintained a careful composure, as though wary of revealing too much of himself. Only in rare, unguarded moments did she glimpse the weariness he concealed, lines of strain around his eyes, a hand that tightened around a quill as though bracing against unspoken fears. She found herself wanting to ease that burden, even as she reminded herself that his world was not hers and likely never could be. One evening, after a particularly tense meeting with his advisors, Edmund dismissed the others yet quietly asked Helene to remain. The library was dim save for the orange glow of the hearth, flickering across shelves filled with the accumulated intellect of generations. He seemed far younger in that light, No longer the formidable Duke, but a solitary man confronted by shadows he could not decipher. "There is rot within my own counsel," he said, his voice low and brittle. "Some days I fear I inherited not a legacy, but a labyrinth of obligations designed to drown me." His confession startled her. Nobles did not bear their vulnerabilities to servants, no matter how trusted. She watched him rest a hand against the mantel, his profile illuminated in stark relief. For the first time since arriving at Hawthorne Hall, she sensed not only authority in him, but yearning. Yearning for someone who might understand him without the filter of title or expectation. She stepped forward, compelled by something beyond duty. "My lord," she said gently, "strength does not lie in appearing invulnerable. It lies in facing what terrifies you, even when the world expects you to stand untouched." Her words hung between them with quiet force. Edmund turned toward her, his expression softened, the tension around his mouth easing as though her presence offered a refuge he had not known he needed. He regarded her with an earnest gravity that made her pulse quicken. "Miss Helene," he murmured, "it is an exhausting thing to stand alone before the world." The sentiment lingered in the warm stillness that followed, and for the first time, Helene felt a fragile thread forming between them, one woven not from gratitude or obligation, but from a shared longing neither could voice. Yet the moment could not last. A knock sounded, abrupt and sharp, and Edmund stepped back at once, reclaiming the austere composure expected of him. The spell dissipated, leaving Helene acutely aware of how precarious her position had become. The next morning, she found the political atmosphere within the estate growing more volatile. The missing document she had attempted to report weighed heavily on her mind. Without it, uncovering the traitor would become infinitely more difficult. Worse, she suspected that whoever had taken it now considered her a threat. Her intuition proved correct sooner than expected. At a formal dinner held to impress visiting dignitaries, Helene was summoned unexpectedly into the great hall. The vast chandeliers glittered with an almost cruel brilliance as she stepped forward, every eye upon her. At the head of the table, Lord Brackenridge, one of Edmund's senior advisors, rose with a self-satisfied air. "It has come to my attention," he announced, "that certain confidential materials have gone missing. Given recent anomalies in staffing, I believe we must consider whether someone within this very household seeks to manipulate the Duke's affairs." His gaze settled on Helene with calculated malice. Gasps murmured through the hall. Helene's throat tightened. The accusation was a blade aimed not only at her integrity, but at Edmund's judgment. Edmund, however, remained motionless, his expression unreadable. He watched her with eyes that held neither doubt nor dismissal, but something deeper, measured, assessing, protective. Yet he did not speak. He could not yet. Protocol demanded restraint until evidence was presented. Brackenridge pressed forward, weaving a narrative that placed Helene at the center of a conspiracy she had fought to prevent. Each word he uttered twisted her earlier courage into a weapon against her. She felt the collective condemnation of the room descend upon her with suffocating force. Still, she lifted her chin, refusing to bend beneath the humiliation. If she yielded now, the traitor would win. She met Edmund's eyes, seeking not rescue, but recognition of the truth she had defended with every step since her dismissal. Something flickered in his gaze, a flare of anger, quiet but resolute, as though her silent plea had summoned a decision he had long delayed. The air between them tightened, electric with the promise of upheaval. Brackenridge's voice droned on, but its triumph began to falter as Edmund's posture shifted with controlled intensity. The hall held its breath as Edmund finally stood, his stillness more commanding than any outcry. Helene felt a tremor of hope stir within her. Whatever he intended, the moment brimmed with the certainty that the tides within Hawthorne Hall were about to turn, and she would not face the storm alone. The hall trembled with anticipation as Edmund rose, his chair scraping softly against the marble floor. A hush swept across the assembled guests. Even the chandeliers seemed to hold their breath as the Duke's gaze settled on Brackenridge with a calm so absolute it bordered on menace. "Before you continue," Edmund said, his voice controlled yet resonant, "I must ask on what grounds you make such accusations." Brackenridge faltered, caught off guard by the Duke's interruption. Helene stood motionless, her hands clasped tightly before her, unsure whether Edmund's intervention signaled salvation or condemnation. Yet the steadiness in his posture, the measured intensity in his eyes, hinted that he had already charted his course. Brackenridge recovered quickly, adopting a tone of wounded dignity. "Your Grace, it is my duty to protect the integrity of your office." This young woman's sudden rise in station, her proximity to sensitive materials, surely these matters warrant scrutiny. His thin smile conveyed his confidence that Edmund would bend beneath the pressure of propriety. But Edmund did not waver. Instead, he produced a folded packet from inside his coat and placed it on the table before him with deliberate precision. "If scrutiny is our purpose," he said, "then let us begin with the truth." Gasps rippled through the room as he revealed the very document that had gone missing, the one Helene had feared lost forever. Edmund explained that an independent inquiry had traced a series of forged entries to Brackenridge himself. The advisor's face drained of color as Edmund laid bare the scheme. The falsified records, the covert correspondences, the attempt to misdirect suspicion onto a servant who had shown more loyalty than entire councils of noblemen. Each revelation tightened the noose around Brackenridge's reputation until the man could do nothing but sputter in protest. Yet the evidence was undeniable. His downfall unfolded before all present, swift and irrevocable, and when the guards escorted him from the hall, no voice dared rise in his defense. Only once Brackenridge had disappeared did Edmund turn to Helene. Her breath caught as he addressed the guests, his tone shifting from authority to something quieter but no less firm. "Miss Helene's conduct," he declared, "has preserved the honor of this house. She acted when others faltered, and her courage has spared us ruin." The statement, delivered with the weight of a public absolution, left the hall in stunned silence. Helene felt the sting of tears she fought to conceal. Yet the moment remained incomplete, suspended between vindication and the unspoken emotions neither she nor Edmund had dared to acknowledge. Later, after the guests had dispersed and the echoes of whispered astonishment faded, Helene found herself standing alone beneath the manor's grand portico. Rain had begun to fall, thin, chilly strands that blurred the lantern light and softened the edges of the night. She had intended to take a quiet moment to steady herself, to breathe freely now that the danger had passed, but the heaviness in her chest did not lift. Vindication had come at a cost. Her presence in the hall had been a spectacle, and she feared what consequences might follow. She wondered whether it would be better for Edmund if she resigned. The thought, born of loyalty rather than despair, lodged painfully in her heart. She turned to leave just as footsteps approached behind her. Edmund stepped into the rain without hesitation, scarcely noticing the droplets that darkened his coat. "Helene," he said, his voice stripped of formality, "must you walk away from me so quickly?" She kept her gaze lowered, not from humility, but from the bewildering intensity of her emotions. "My lord," she replied softly, "I fear I have already caused you too much trouble. My presence will only bring further scandal." He exhaled sharply, as though the suggestion wounded him. "Do not flee from me," he said, moving closer. "Not now. Not when I have only just begun to understand what my life could be with you in it." The confession, restrained yet fervent, opened something within her that she had tried to keep sealed. She met his eyes, seeing not a duke but a man who had chosen her over the comfort of convention. Yet doubt lingered, fragile and persistent. "Society will not understand," she whispered. "They will say you have lost your judgment." Edmund stepped nearer still, his voice steady. "Let them say what they will. They have no authority over my heart." For a moment, rain fell between them like a thin curtain, and then he reached for her hand with a reverence that made her breath tremble. At dawn the following morning, the great hall lay bathed in pale gold. The household assembled at Edmund's request, unaware of the purpose. Helene entered hesitantly, uncertain why she had been summoned. Edmund awaited her at the center of the room, and when she approached, he spoke with a clarity that cut through every whisper, every doubt. "Miss Helene," he said, "you once saved my reputation. Now I ask that you share my future." He knelt, an act so shocking in its humility that several maids gasped outright, and presented a ring, simple yet elegant, its design bearing the crest of his house. "I can endure the censure of society," he continued, "but I cannot endure a life in which you are absent." Emotion rose within her like a tide. She accepted with a single word, quiet, trembling, irrevocably sincere. The staff, stunned but moved, bowed instinctively as Edmund rose and took her hand in his. In that moment, the rigid hierarchy of Hawthorne Hall shifted, cracking open to admit a love that had defied circumstance and expectation. The narrator of time would later say that their marriage sent ripples through England, some scandalized, some inspired. But within the hall that morning, the world felt still, as though pausing to acknowledge a union forged not from convenience or lineage, but from courage, trust, and the improbable convergence of two souls who refused to remain strangers.